You have imagined this moment. You have savoured the prospect with an almost greedy anticipation. Now, it's finally here. So where then is your father's wrath? Where is his horror? Where is his anything? You expected the chastising fury of an enraged patriarch or the anguished pleading of a heartbroken parent, but he just stands there, staring at you. Your glory is something to behold. You haven't seen him for a long time. You've changed. You've grown. You're not the child he remembers. Maybe he needs a moment to accept that. He's changed too. He seems small, a shadow of his former self. In truth, you were secretly afraid of this reunion. The father you remember was a huge and terrible force of majesty. His presence always overwhelmed you. At his side, long ago, during those 30 perfect years, you always felt safe and scared in equal measure. He was everything. You adored him with every fibre of your being. You flinched every time he spoke a word. But look at him. Look at him. Oh, he still appears impressive, the golden armor glinting in its own sunlight, the mantle about his shoulders like a cloak of silks cut from the finest damask nightfall and the richest royal blood. The stature, the serenity, the long and gleaming black hair, the noble hallowed face, the crown of radiance that rests upon him, the imperial aspect. But he does seem small. It's the natural way of things, you presume. To a child, a father seems an infallible, perfect giant. But the child grows up. He begins to notice the flaws and imperfections. The child matures, and the father grows ever smaller and more fragile. You wonder that you were ever cowed by him. You have outgrown him. This is what you were afraid of. This, a man in antique armor, come to remonstrate with you and exert his authority. He still thinks he can subdue you with the merest look or utterance. Not anymore. You realize you have always been afraid of what you thought he was, not what he actually is. You hope his silence indicates that he has reached a similar conclusion. It is time for him to be afraid of you. Perhaps he's choosing his words carefully. You have killed my son. Hey guys, welcome to another video, and this one's going to be a little bit weird. So you may have noticed that the Horus heresy ended. The final book for the Siege of Terra came out a few months ago, and one of the videos I've been working on is a video on the Emperor's fight versus Horus, and kind of a fight breakdown, and I have kind of split the video into 3 sections. So the first is kind of me reading the excerpts. The second is my narrative on what I think about the fights. And then the third part of this video is going to be kind of an interview between me and my good friend Quipster, who you've inevitably seen before. Say hi, Quipster. And hi, so that's what we're recording today. However, I thought I would just upload this as a separate kind of podcast. So let's start off by looking specifically at the Emperor at the moment he goes into the throne room. Because very famously, as we know at this point, he doesn't go alone. There are 3 people with him. He has Caecautus Dusk, a Heteron Custodian, the last Custodian with the Emperor on the Vengeful Spirit, or at least within the City of Dusk, or it's in the Warp. Everything's kind of become one at this point. Basically, the Vengeful Spirit is like this anchor pulling the Solar Realm into the Warp. So he's with the Emperor. There are still some with Constantine Valdor, but those won't be discussed in this video. Then we've got Litu, who was the prototype Space Marine, character we discussed on the channel before. He was previously serving Erda, who was the mother of the Primarchs. However, he has sworn to Erda that he will fulfill a promise to her. We don't know at the start of the book what the promise is, but it's something involving the Emperor, and now he's come to defend the Emperor. And the final person he's with, of course, is Garvior Loken, the greatest space marine of all time. And he was the son of Horus Lupercal. According to Horus, Garvior Loken was his favoured son. However, Loken never turned on the Emperor, and so he has actually gone with the Master of Mankind to fight against his demon son. So there are a couple of things I think that are important to know before the fight begins. So the first thing that's really important to know, and this was kind of like a kind of a retcon, but also I guess it was a necessary retcon, and maybe people kind of guessed this would happen. But at this point in the book, it's really important to know that the Emperor is far less powerful than Horus.
Yeah, 100%. This is the really interesting things that happens right at the beginning of the fight. The Emperor instantly loses. Like, bang. Like, the first thing that happens is he loses. Like, he just gets mind blasted by Horus immediately, and he's on his knees dying.
True. I will say as well, if you are someone who is such an Emperor fan, an Imperial fan, that you cannot stand the idea of the Emperor getting his ass kicked, this is going to be a tough book for you, because it happens multiple times. Quite famously, by this point, the internet knows Sanguinius dies by being beaten like a dog. And this book is really dark in that respect. There's a point in the fight, which we'll talk about later, where Dan Abnett specifically uses this wording around Horus basically beating the Emperor into Sanguinius. And occasionally you'll hear the internet say things like Warhammer 40k has lost its grimdark. But I'll be honest, there were times in this series where I would read stuff and I would be like, Jesus, Dan, that's so much. like,
especially like when he beats Sanguinius to death. Yeah. Like, that was hard to read. And especially because, like, they give you hope only to tear. I think this is the hallmark of grimdark as a whole. The hope exists, and you know it's going to be dashed. And the best example, one of the best examples of that, is the Horus Sanguinius fight, sort of a quick tangent, because Sanguinius actually wins on a mortal level. When it's kept at that mortal level and Horus doesn't turn on God mode, Sanguinius actually wins the physical fight. And then Horus goes, nope, turns it on, and then just beats him to death like a dog.
Yes.
And you just feel that gut-wrenching, like, oh, if only.
So, according to Horus, he could have beaten the Emperor at any point in time during the fight. However, he kept the Emperor alive because he actually wanted the Emperor to survive into his new Imperium. And in the previous novel, we get an explanation as to why he wanted the Emperor to stick around. And that is because he wanted 4 avatars, each one representing one of the 4 Chaos Gods. And he wanted Sanguinius to become the avatar of Nurgle, because eternal life he thought would be appealing to somebody who has prophesied their own death. Constantine Valdor would be the avatar of Tzeentch, Rogel Dawn of Khorne, and the Emperor of Slaanesh. The idea being that the Emperor has, been fastidiously planning things for 10,000 years, and all of a sudden maybe he's going to want to have a good time. So Horus actually thought the Emperor might want to serve him somehow as this kind of like embodiment of Slaanesh almost, which was a really, I think, bad guess by Horus. I don't think that was ever going to come about. I would just go back a bit first, actually, sorry, before we move on, because what's so interesting about the Emperor and Horus is that the Emperor doesn't realize that he is outmatched by his son until he teleports onto the flagship of the Vengeful Spirit. And when the Emperor teleports along with Dawn, Sanguinius, etc., they all get split up, and the Emperor and about half the Custodians land on Embarkation Deck 8. That doesn't sound like a problem, except there are only 6 embarkation decks of the Vengeful Spirit. So they've landed in this kind of a little pocket realm that Horus has created for them. And almost immediately, Horus demonstrates to his father how powerful he is, because he ends up twisting the minds of the Emperor's own guardians. That's the wording used in the book. And many of the Custodians turn and attack the Emperor. The Emperor has to euthanize his own guardians, and the ones that survive alive, he ends up having to pop it so that they won't be dominated by Horus. And as the Emperor kind of absorbs more power from the warp, he ends up burning out the minds of his own custodians. And that's why there's only Kaycauter's Dusk at this point, because all of the other custodians were either killed by Horus or the Emperor during their like kind of mind battle that's been going on. And Kaycauter's only survives because he had a mark placed on him by Malkador before he teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit. And in a way, I think that's Kaycauter's role, or part of his role in the story, is he represents Malkador's kind of help for the Emperor. I mentioned that the Emperor is kind of drawing in power from the warp as he goes through the Vengeful Spirit. This kind of goes into the main plot line of the second End of the Death volume, which is around this character called the Dark King. And it's revealed that the Emperor, and his attempts to beat Horus, was going to absorb so much power from the warp, he would actually ascend to becoming a Chaos God, or at least a god of the warp. And if he did that, the warp would turn to madness for millions of years, and humanity would almost certainly be driven to extinction. It would be like the birth of Slanesh, but times a million, and the galaxy would basically be consumed by the warp if the Emperor had done this. Ultimately, the Emperor is convinced by Ollanius Persson to give up his godhood, and when he does that, he actually slices off part of his own soul, because he realizes that he would need to sacrifice those human parts of himself, his love, loyalty, compassion, in order to face his son. You know, even someone like the Emperor, as dispassionate as he can be, he knows he wouldn't be able to handle the guilt of killing his own son. And at this point, he started to realize that he might have to spend the next 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. And he knows that that guilt would destroy him if he kept it. So he's sliced off part of his soul and given up all of this power. However, one thing that I thought was really cool, though, at the start of the book, is Dan Abnett makes a very kind of important point, I thought, Quipster, to demonstrate the power of the Emperor at this stage, because as they're moving towards Horus, the Emperor and the gang come across a Wordbearer's company, and the Emperor destroys it almost instantly. And so whilst the Emperor is outmatched, he is still at a very high power level and far more powerful than any Primarch would typically be.
100%. And I think, sort of going back, there's a few things to mention about this that people have brought up. So, with the Custodians immediately turning on the Emperor as soon as they hit the embarkation deck, a lot of people out there have said, like, oh, how could this happen? It's bad writing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm a Custodians fan. I'm literally wearing a Custodians t-shirt. I've got my Custodians army behind me. Like, I'm the biggest Custodians fanboy ever. But I loved this moment where the Custodians turn on the Emperor. And I love it for a very specific reason. It shows just how powerful Horus has become and just how badly things are going for the Emperor. Like, they've teleported into this essentially, like, quasi-warp realm where, like, the material realm and the warp realm sort of, like, converge, and the rules are not the same anymore. And the Custodians turning is so emblematic of that and tells you so many things in one fell swoop that I think it's a genius move, personally, because this is the kind of thing that will never happen again.
Yes.
There is no set of circumstances that will converge to allow this in any story terms. It's very, very good at showing the desperation and power involved in this situation. So, number one, that's why I love this particular bit. But also sort of going back to the fight with the Emperor and Horus, one thing I think we're going to come back to quite a lot, because you mentioned earlier how Horus mentions at any point he could have just killed the Emperor. And it's true. That is the kind of level of power we're dealing with here. But the warp as an entity is full of metaphor, of symbolism. And it's not enough for Horus to have just killed the Emperor. He had to prove he was better than the Emperor. And so there's this sort of deep-seated insecurity that a lot of the Primarchs have, actually, that meant that he needed to prove himself, not just in the eyes of the Chaos Gods, but in the eyes of himself. I'm better than you, Father. This is the world as I see it, not how you see it. And so, yeah, that sort of internal insecurity is going to come up again and again and again in this fight because Horus constantly has something to prove. And ultimately, that leads to his downfall.
I think you're exactly right. The way I would describe this is that the vengeful spirit is kind of the center of this. It's the center of Horus's power, and it's being pulled into the warp, and with that, it's said the entire solar realm, so including Terra, is sinking into the warp, and we see the ramifications of that through the Siege of Terra, and literally you can walk down a street and end up in a different part of the planet. It's very bad, right? And Horus has tricked the Emperor, because through the rest of the Siege of Terra, Horus appears insane. And as a reader, most of us kind of assumed he was. He appears very much insane. He's talking to people that are dead, figments of his imagination. However, it's revealed at the end of the series that this was all a trick because the Emperor has been keeping an eye on Horus and trying to watch in on him. And so Horus caused himself to go insane. It's described as kind of placing his mind back in the past. And this form of insanity has come over the son, and so the father decides he can win the fight. However, once the Emperor teleports onto the vengeful spirit, at that point Horus regains his faculties, and there's a point, actually, there's a really cool quote where even like the word bearers, when Horus regains his majesty and his power, even they flee in terror. That's how like terrifying Horus has become. And I like to think of it that in terms of how it can never happen again, in this series, the Emperor has basically teleported into the warp to face the ultimate avatar of chaos. It's basically like going into the warp to fight against a chaos god. That's how outmatched I think the Emperor is at this stage. Which leads me on to another really interesting idea, and I think Dan Abnett does a really good job of kind of leaving this up to the reader. So one of the things that, if you're an Imperial fanboy, you will undoubtedly have said is that Horus is a pawn. And that's what Abaddon will say. He was just a tool of the Chaos Gods. And I think Dan Abnett does a really good job of kind of leaving that up to the reader. Because there are times where, as you say, it appears that Horus is trying to please the Chaos Gods, who literally turn up to the fight and squeal and laugh and are so delighted with this idea that Horus and the Emperor are going to fight each other, and that, you know, basically they're with popcorn. You can't not see it as the meme that it is. But like at the same time, there are parts throughout the fight in the sequence which do suggest that Horus was a necessary part of the Chaos Gods' plan. And ultimately, they see the entire fight as a loss for them. They are very angry at the outcome of the fight. And so the idea that Horus was just a pawn, I think, is kind of up to you to decide. Potentially, he would have been able to achieve total dominion over the galaxy. And there are, in some ways, he didn't need the Chaos Gods and was able to kind of push past their power.
I think he doesn't have to be a pawn to have his insecurities played on. One thing that becomes very apparent as the fight goes on is Horus's self-delusion about what he's doing. He's constantly trying to teach the Emperor a lesson, but his hypocrisy means that he cannot learn the lessons he's trying to teach. A good example of that is the way that he talks about Loken. Loken turning up to the fight affects him. It just affects him.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the way it affects him and what Loken represents in the Lunar Wolves, or the Sons of Horus, is really interesting because Horus in the Mournival surrounded himself with different aspects of kind of the person he wanted to be, or different aspects of what he thought was himself. So Loken took the place of Sejanus. Sejanus is supposed to be the best Astartes there ever was. Not just in terms of how good he was and how skilled he was, but just the best guy ever. And he's replaced with Loken. Loken is therefore supposed to be that person in the Mournival and the Legion. He is the unbreakable heart of the Legion. And Horus invests him with that power. And so, by Loken not turning away, he becomes this sort of anchor of shame for Horus, in the same way kind of to a degree Garrow does for Mortarion. He has a lot to prove to Loken. He tries to bring him over to his side, because by bringing Loken over to his side, He therefore knows. He knows 100% that what he's doing is right. And I think in every action he does, especially in this last fight, there's that glimmer inside of Horus of doubt. Like, oh, I couldn't turn Loken, so is what I'm doing right? I couldn't turn the Emperor to my side. Is what I'm doing right? And that piece of guilt is what the Emperor feeds on in the end. So I don't think Horus has to necessarily be a puppet to have his insecurities played on for his what he thinks are his own ends anyway.
Absolutely. There are many lines throughout the book that we'll probably look at in the video where they do sound like Horus trying to reassure himself that he's not making a mistake. But yeah, anyway, let's move on then to the actual fight. The first thing to note actually is a really cool kind of interaction when the Emperor first goes into the throne room is that the Emperor doesn't say much to Horus. He keeps repeating himself. So Horus, addresses his father, a very magnanimous speech. I don't know if that's the correct use of the word magnanimous, but it felt right. And the Emperor just keeps repeating himself and saying, "You killed my son. You killed my son." And then why? And why? And Horus it grows increasingly annoyed at the fact that his father isn't really engaging with him. And eventually Horus realizes why his father isn't engaging with him. Because as he looks at his father, he realizes that the Emperor is looking past him and he's looking behind him at the Chaos Gods who have turned up to watch the Emperor fight against Horus and are loving it. They're having such a good time. And so when the Emperor says, "You have killed my son," he's not saying that to Horus about Sanguinius, he's saying that to the Chaos Gods about Horus. And at this point, we realize that the Emperor considers Horus dead. He considers him a lost cause.
There are sort of two ways I think of looking at this particular scene. Number one, the Emperor looks at Horus and he is disappointed in both himself and the way the situation has turned out, and incredibly angry with the Chaos Gods. The second way of looking at it is he understands Horus so completely that he knows exactly what it will take to goad him into doing things, which is why Loken is there, which is why he doesn't talk to him.
It's also why I think Caecautus is there. Caecautus, this happens multiple times in the book, Caecautus really annoys Horus Lupercal. he really annoys him. And every time he speaks, Horus is like, "Shut up! Stop talking!" And it's quite interesting because there's a point in the novel, he talks in the first person as if he's talking for the Emperor. Now, at multiple times, we have seen the Emperor talk through a custodian. And so that might be what's happening here. However, I don't think it is. It looks like Caecautus Dusk says the Emperor's voice is the only voice he's ever known. It's always been in his head. And so that's how he talks to Horus. He even says "my son" when he talks to Horus. But I don't think he is the Emperor at that point. It goes back to something Valdor says in Two Metaphysical Blades. When the Emperor is put onto the Golden Throne, he doesn't have the Emperor in his head anymore, and that's really weird. To have had that your whole life. There's a really interesting thing there, but every time Caecautus Dusk talks, it's really annoying for Horus. He's like, "Shut up." And it might also go back to this kind of general kind of idea with the Custodians, which I'm sure you'll be a big fan of, is this idea that the Emperor treats the Custodians kind of far nicer than he does anyone else, including the Primarchs. And he certainly has a plan for the Custodians in his future Imperium, which he doesn't seem to have for the Space Marines and the Primarchs, and evidently the Thunder Warriors. Perhaps Horus has realised that idea. The Emperor maybe loves the Custodians more than the Primarchs, and that concept just bothers him.
Yeah, I find that actually fascinating as well. One of the things that becomes very apparent in Horus's demeanor throughout this interaction is his utter ego and arrogance. He knows for a fact that he is the most important person. Anyone daring to speak up to him, especially someone who's not the Emperor, just needs to shut up. And so he, expresses this great ego that he has throughout everything he's talking about. He's talking about I've got I have this place for the Emperor at my side. I've got this place for Loken at my side. If only they would see the light. And again, he talks about, oh, if Sanguinius saw the light, I had a place for him. No, he didn't. Like, the whole point about his interaction with Sanguinius was he tried to have him killed at Cygnus Prime. And the reason he tried to kill Sanguinius at Cygnus Prime was because he was a threat to his position as favored of the Chaos Gods. So you can't just, he's just lying to himself. When he says, like, he's magnanimous, you used the word correctly, when he says all these things to be magnanimous in victory, he's just lying. And because we see it from first-person perspective, he's lying to himself and us as the audience. And it's fascinating to watch.
So when Horus realizes that the Emperor is kind of talking through him to the Chaos Gods, he gets incredibly annoyed and he smites the Emperor down with one blow. And the Emperor is out cold. And when this happens, of course, Kekautus Dusk, Litu, and Gavior Loken kind of look on in horror, the idea that the Emperor could be brought low so easily. And this scene, I'll be honest, very much reminded me of that Avengers Endgame scene, because they all kind of like dive in and attack Horus as one. The difference in the scene is that Horus is so powerful he basically doesn't notice. These are three of the greatest warriors in the entire setting. Each strike is like a death strike, it's said, but Horus is just able to kind of repel or regenerate any wound done to him, and so he really doesn't know. But then, to your point about kind of Loken there, Loken is there to try and agitate Horus. And so when he starts to think about it, and that idea that his son, his favored son, has now come to attack him, it makes him so angry that eventually he stops concentrating on the Emperor and decides to go after the three warriors attacking him.
Exactly. And I think one of, kind of, if you think about it for a second, one of the funniest things that happens in this fight is that Horus gets so annoyed with these three, he just kicks all three of them into different dimensions.
Yes. Yeah. So as Loken and Litu and Kekautus are fighting, Loken is very much saying, do it, kill me, prove to me what you've become. And eventually, Horus turns his attention to the three warriors attacking him and goes to strike them down. He beats Kekautus aside, and then he goes to use his kind of his power to destroy Loken and Litu, and that is where the Emperor's power is revealed, because they are saved from Horus's blast by the Emperor, and that's how we know that the Emperor is now up and the fight can kind of properly begin. That's where we start entering this really interesting place in the book, something we've never really seen, I don't think, in 40k, this idea that Horus and the Emperor start fighting across dimensions. So we see how the fight looks from Litu's point of view. It's just this thing you can't even get involved in, so they can't even try and help the Emperor. Kekautus Dusk, Litu, and Gavior Loken are kicked either into like another dimension, or they're kicked so far away they can't really get back into the fight because it takes so long. Kekautus Dusk is in a really bad shape. He's basically nearly dead at this point. He actually describes himself as dead. He's only alive because of the Emperor's will sustains him, and he keeps repeating the phrase, by his will, because he thinks he's only alive by the power of the Emperor. Loken, who we're probably not going to talk about for a while now, he is kicked kind of into this dimension where he ends up fighting against the Mournival, who take on the form of Sagittary or centaurs, and this is of course very symbolic, and it's definitely something I'd recommend you read. If people are interested, we'll probably go through it in another video, but it takes you kind of back through the heresy, takes you right back to the start and the idea of the Mournival, so that was a really kind of cool fan moment I thought to read. But Litu was the one I wanted to talk about briefly, because I loved this storyline. Really cool little scene. Litu's a very interesting character because he's a kind of apart from the Great Crusade, but he knows his mother, Erda, greatly loved Sanguinius, and so he takes on the role of kind of going to defend the body of Sanguinius, who, of course, all these demons now coming out to devour, and so he stands in front of the body of Sanguinius and tries to defend him. And in fact, slight tangent, but I thought I wanted to know your thoughts on this. One thing I noted in the book was that when Litu defends the body of Sanguinius, he notes how Sanguinius doesn't seem to be just dead. he notes that something worse has happened to Sanguinius. And given the events of things like Darkness in the Blood and 40k, which is a storyline that kind of talks a lot about Sanguinius' soul, and the idea that we have a golden angel and a black angel that seem to symbolize the two halves of Sanguinius' soul, I think that's what Dan Abnett is hinting towards, this idea that the soul of Sanguinius wasn't just sent to the warp as like Ferrus Manus' was. It's actually been shattered, and there are at least two components of his soul. That's what I think he's hinting at there. Any thoughts on that?
It's tough to say. I mean, one of the interesting things about this scene first is the fact that there are three of the Astartes in it, 2 Astartes and a Custodian, and each one is sort of kicked into a separate dimension where a different type of fight is happening. So you have Litu, who is in the dimension of the Emperor and Horus going at each other in a physical way. They are physically fighting man to man with swords and claws and stuff against each other. Then you have Kaikaltus, who is in this sort of this realm where it looks like essentially they're fighting with magic against each other. You've got this gale and gust of winds that he's having to fight against to be able to even stand upright. And then you have Loken. Loken is in sort of this psychic representation of the throne room while this fight is going on, and that's almost, and he can only see echoes of the fight, and it's almost like he's watching the spiritual battle happen between Horus and the Emperor. And so I thought it was really interesting to see those 3 different things, and also it's interesting to see who ended up seeing which type of fight, because obviously Loken is very much the embodiment of the spirit wolves. He was supposed to be the best of everything the Lunar Wolves had to offer. And so, Horus imbued him with that sort of like spiritual essence of the Legion. Kaikaltus, I don't really have a theory as to why he saw the warp battle, other than the fact that that was an aspect that needed to be shown. And then you have Litu seeing the sort of martial prowess of the Emperor, being that he was not an agent of, the warp or anything. But going back to Sanguinius, that's a really interesting part where Litu just like, oh, he's dead. Like, he is not just dead, but Sanguinius is so dead that it's almost as if he was never alive. There's nothing there of his spirit.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe 2 ways of looking at that. Number 1, it could be that his spirit was so damaged by what happened to him that his soul has completely shattered. Or there could be this could be a thing by Games Workshop. It could just be them signaling, look, he's never coming back. Like, full stop. The physical body of Sanguinius will never return. I think there is kind of an element of that. But I think on top of that, I think it's just sort of emphasizing the hopelessness of the situation as much as anything else. Like, the point of Sanguinius is that he is the embodiment of hope. He is, because all the Primarchs are supposed to be a physical embodiment of some aspect of the Emperor. Sanguinius is the Emperor's hope. And more than that, he symbolizes the hope of the Imperium in creating a better age. And so in his death is literally the death of all hope for the setting. And I think them describing him in this way is emblematic of that as much as anything else. He's the idea of hope is so dead, it's almost like it was never there in the first place. If that makes sense.
Very cool. And there's, of course, a lot of symbolism in the book. One thing I will say, actually, is if you haven't got the book, I would maybe try and get one from a friend if you read the audiobook, because the afterword is really quite interesting. And Dan Abnett goes through a lot of the symbolism and inspiration he had for the novel, and it's very apparent. And it's really interesting to read through the book once you know that stuff. Yeah, sorry, I will say, for the people watching this on the members stream, members video, It's quite hard not to jump ahead at times. So I appreciate this is, we're kind of moving about, but it is quite frankly so exciting. It's kind of hard to stay in one place. But let's focus on then, I guess, more on the Emperor and Horus and their fight. So exactly as you talked about, the other three warriors have been kicked into other dimensions. Specifically, that wording is used. At that point, we get a kind of a bigger focus on the fight between the Emperor and Horus. And speaking about symbolism, this is where a lot of symbolism comes in. So to start with, we get a really interesting kind of description of their fight and the supremacy that is the combat prowess of the Emperor of Mankind. There's a really interesting little description, I think, that comes from Leto in the book that talks about how the Emperor fights at times very much like the Eldari. If you're familiar at all with characters like Eldrad Ulthuan, it is heavily suggested that the Emperor works with the Eldar in the past, so potentially he was trained by an Autarch or something at some point in time. And so there's little things like that are sprinkled in that really make the fight kind of come to life, and things that you'd imagine are true for the Emperor. From there, the psychological games really begin. We've spoken about the Emperor kind of being this master manipulator, and this is something that Horus talks about a lot. And the irony, of course, will come later. But it's really interesting to read about how Horus views the Emperor of Mankind, because he very much talks about the Emperor as kind of like the trickster god, Kegarak, who, the Emperor, is the master trickster. He pretended to make a deal with the Chaos Gods and then stole their power. He pretended to be the greatest figure in the universe, but now he sees that his father is nothing. The Emperor is just a liar and a fraud. And to manipulate his son, he ends up using Horus's realm that he's created, because the vengeful spirit is connected to this realm known as the Inevitable City, this realm that was either created by Horus or for Horus. It's not clear. That connects the vengeful spirit to Terra, to the warp, to everywhere. And in this realm, time is kind of irrelevant. And so the book actually talks about how the Emperor and Horus fight across time. And so they fight, for example, on Chthoniya. And it's not just that the Emperor has, made this realm for them to fight in that looks like Chthoniya. According to Horus, it is Chthoniya. They have travelled back through time to fight on this planet, and they go to other places as well. And I guess it's up to you, the reader, to decide if they're actually there. Horus responds by turning the place into the Himalayan mountains, and then the Emperor responds by turning it into Istvan 5, and then Horus responds. And so each time they are turning the realm or traveling to places that they think would elicit some sort of emotional reaction. The Emperor is trying to prove to Horus that he is the traitor, he is the betrayer, but Horus is trying to show to his father that his father is actually the traitor. There's a fantastic line in the book, I think, where Horus says that, you call me a heretic, but you can't be a heretic to lies, or something like that. And so that's kind of how Horus is justifying his actions. And of course, one of the most important places that they go is Molech. The Emperor and Horus both went to where they made their deals with the Chaos Gods, and where the Emperor betrayed the Chaos Gods and stole some of their fire. But according to Horus, that fire was supposed to be shared, and it was not.
When the fight enters this sort of next phase and they're fighting across these realms of literally time and space, that, I think, is the kind of place that you expect the Emperor to inhabit. That's kind of where you expected this fight to go, in a way, because it was just like the Emperor, especially in the future, and in the year 40k, is supposed to be this omniscient being that's kind of everywhere at once and sees all the things. And this is really interesting because it kind of shows how he's able to do that. He's kind of able to be in so many different times and places all at once, doing different things. And we've never actually seen him doing that before. It's always just been inferred. And I think it's even more fascinating that he's losing in a whole bunch of them. No matter how powerful he is, he's getting the shit kicked out of him.
Exactly, to your point, Horus loses this first fight. He says that the Emperor wins because the Emperor has demonstrated to Horus that he is the seducer and has kind of brought him to this place. And Horus losing this kind of version of the fight changes the game. He changes the game, and this time he changes it to a game of the tarot, which is people have said it's a lot like they had a Yu-Gi-Oh battle during this fight, and it kind of is what happened. So the Imperial Tarot are cards that come up a lot in Warhammer 40k. They prophesized, for example, the return of Lionel Johnson, and they are supposedly connected to the psyche. They are psychoactive crystal wafers supposedly made by the Emperor and connected to his psyche, and in theory, if you know how to read them, you can get messages from the Emperor. However, they use the cards as playing cards, essentially. And the cards that they use are very telling and certainly something you can kind of read into a lot, I think. So there are some cards that are clearly them kind of playing out the heresy, but some of the cards I did want to talk about quite briefly because I thought they have really interesting descriptions. So one of the cards that is played, for example, is the Despoiler. And of course, that makes you think of Abaddon. And this is a really interesting description by Dan Abnett, I thought. So the Despoiler, hang on, let me go. Yes, so like death, it is an apparently sinister card, and many fear it, but in truth it manifests a singularly neutral and controlled power. Its iconography represents an abrupt shift, a sudden and unforeseen reversal of fortune. Imperial readers usually perceive this to be a drastic change to the detriment of the Imperium, but it is only that if you want it to be. The reason that's so interesting to me is because as a big Abaddon fan, I of course imagine Abaddon being kind of the central antagonist of the setting in Warhammer 40k, but that card very much plays into this idea that I think fans of the Black Legion really like, which is this idea that Abaddon doesn't actually love chaos. He, in a way, feels like he was forced into this position, and there are many genuinely noble qualities to Abaddon the Despoiler. That card seems to make it quite clear that it doesn't necessarily mean he is evil. That's just always a possibility. So the question with Abaddon the Despoiler is, will he ever be ultimately corrupted by chaos, or will he just use gifts of the Chaos Gods to achieve his aims? And I really liked that kind of description, and I suspect that's a nod to something that will happen in 30, 40 years if Warhammer 40k ever ends.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, going back to the spoiler one, I think one thing a lot of people were surprised by, and it's nice to see them address, was the fact that we all know, as people who play 40k or who read the books, that Abaddon becomes very, very central to where 40k as a setting goes. And that is just not set up at all in the early Heresy. And it's later in the Heresy, especially in the Siege, where they begin to start addressing that. It's kind of it's just nice to see them giving that kind of weight and importance to Abaddon as a character, because he is that important. But that's a bit of an aside. Going back to the idea of what the Despoiler is, I think it is fascinating the description they've used, because it does kind of make you doubt whether it is Abaddon or are they talking about something else. It almost seems like a bit of a Dark King switcheroo. Because obviously, the whole time the Dark King is coming up, you think, oh, of course, it's Horus. It's not. It's the Emperor. And so, is it Abaddon? Is that just a moniker that's been applied to him mistakenly? I don't know. It leaves a bit of wiggle room there for them, narratively speaking, as well.
A couple other cards I thought were really interesting. So one of the cards that Horus plays is the Dark King, which I think might be a nod to how the kind of idea of the Dark King will be used in Warhammer 40k. Yes, the Emperor gave up his divinity, but now the name, the Dark King, will forever represent this idea that the Emperor was, for a time, willing to risk burning out the Emperor was willing to risk burning out his entire race in order to beat Horus Lupercal. And that's why Horus plays the card, because he thinks it will get a reaction from the Emperor, given that this was potentially the biggest mistake the Emperor ever made, which was pretty cool. Another one I really liked, this one comes up, this card comes up a lot in Warhammer 40k, which is the Lightning Tower. You'll often hear the Lightning Tower referenced. This is a nod to something that happened a very long time ago when the Emperor was rising on old Terra, Earth, and when he was, making his campaigns to kind of gather perpetuals to his cause and help humanity advance forward, one of his enemies was the Cognitae, and they created this tower, which we know as the Tower of Babel. And the Emperor eventually conquered this tower with his war master at the time, Ollanius Persson. However, Ollanius, upon realizing that this tower contained an entire lexicon of the language of Enuncia, would massively enhance the Emperor's power and ultimately lead to the Emperor becoming a tyrant from his point of view. He uses a word of Enuncia to have lightning strike the tower and destroy it. And it's a very important part of the Emperor's backstory and defined a lot of what he became, which I thought was really cool.
One thing that kind of struck me about the Emperor's journey is this kind of cyclical nature to it. Like, he takes over the known world using a War Master. That War Master then betrays him because the War Master that he's chosen to have by his side thinks that the Emperor will become a tyrant. And that happens.
Yes.
We don't know how many times down the ages that has happened, but it's at least happened twice. And that's more than once. That means it's a pattern.
Although this is only a couple of pages, I feel like I might do an entire video on this at some point because there are so many little nods to things that have happened or will happen. So another one I wanted to talk about is the card of the Revenger. And the Revenger is a card that Leto finds at the end of the novel. Leto is the only person to survive and make it back to Terra from this conflict. And not end up on the Golden Throne, I should say. And the Revenger is the card he uses, which is interesting in and of itself. It implies that's going to be Leto's role in the future of the setting. However, the card is also used in the fight, and it kills an assassin. And so potentially, I think this might be what Dan Abnett is, going to hint towards. And as a fan, you can't help but speculate. The idea potentially Leto is going to be... He's going to have some sort of role in saving the Emperor in some regard. And certainly, I imagine that would be the only purpose he would foresee for himself going forward, which was pretty cool. There are many ways you can kind of read into the cards that are played. It's a very cool scene. And worth noting that Horus wins this fight. He wins this game of cards. And again, the cards that are left by the Emperor, when you finish the book, if you read it again, you'll see that these cards do a lot to kind of hint about the things that are still in play for the Emperor. So the Emperor may be down, but he's not out, and he has 6 cards left. Those cards are the Guardsman, which represents Ollanius Persson. However, what's interesting about that is that implies the Emperor knew Ollanius was going to show up somehow. And then we've got the Throne. The Throne, of course, will be vital for saving the Emperor or kind of keeping the Emperor in his current state. The Space Marine, which I believe is going to be Leto, because the next card is the Knight of Mandatio, which is the name of the chapter where Loken appears. So it appears to be a reference to Loken there. The Lantern is a reference to the Astronomicon, which the Dark Angels on Terra are trying to fix, along with members of what will become the Imperial Cult, so that they can get their Astronomicon relit so Gilliman can find Terra, and ultimately that, in theory, might help give the Emperor a bit of a power boost, which may or may not be foreshadowing for what we're going to talk about later. And then finally, Revelation, which is, I suspect, just a nod to himself, that his own power, because Revelation is a name that the Emperor often gives when he appears to people, because he often appears to people in various forms, and Revelation is one of the more famous ones. But yeah, those are kind of like the 6 cards the Emperor has left to play.
The entire thing is described in terms of utter desperation. The Emperor is like absolutely desperately being like, "Oh, you play this, so I gotta play that. So I've gotta play that." So, and you can see at every stage he is throwing all of the weight of his intellect and everything he's got at this. But right at the end, he has the 6 cards that end up being fundamental to the future of his rule and humanity. So you could almost be like, wow, that's kind of genius how he managed to pull that one off. So it's interesting that in that fight, and also sort of going back to the Revenger and the Assassin, that particular moment. The whole point about this fight is that it's a metaphorical fight because they're fighting in. they're not actually throwing cards at each other. They're throwing cards that are emblematic of people and potential events that might happen in the future at each other. They're throwing time and occurrence and, what might be and what could have been at each other in this sort of apocalyptic battle. And that's just represented by the cards, which is why I really like this scene. But that sort of got me thinking about the Revenger and the Assassin, like you mentioned just then, because my mind went to two places. Number one, Iskander Khayon, and number two, Cypher.
Hey.
And it sort of strikes me like, okay, is Cypher the assassin, or is Cypher the Revenger in that scenario? And Iskander Khayon is, we know he's on Terra right now. We know he's being interrogated right now by the Inquisition. And so these events and these cards that the Horus and the Emperor are throwing at each other, these are purposefully described things. And so, like, Dan Abnett has this thing, he likes to sprinkle in, things in his books that appear way later. Could this be him setting something up to do with Iskander Khayon or Cypher going into the future? And something that might lead to a confrontation with maybe Litu. I don't know, we'll see. Also, inherently, Revenger is a very funny, silly word. It sounds like something out of a Marvel.
I feel like maybe I'll just do a stream talking about that one, passage at some point, because there's so much you could read from it in terms of, as you say, Dan Abnett is clearly hinting at things or storylines, at the very least, that he'd like to write in the future. So very cool stuff. And as we say, Horus wins that one. The Emperor is down for the second time. Not the last time, but he's down for the second time at this point. He is completely limp. He is laid bare. Litu at this point can see the Emperor's body, which takes us on to kind of one of my favorite moments from the book. It is a classic story from Warhammer 40k. If you've never read this book, you will undoubtedly have seen this happening. And that is the last stand of the Custodian. And what's really cool about this is that in 40k mythology, before the Horus heresy came out, there was this idea that maybe a Terminator stood between the Emperor and Horus at one point, or maybe it was a Custodian. However, Countess Dusk is literally a Terminator Custodian. So he is both of them. So he is not the only, but he is a hero. He is a man who stands between the father and the son, and we get his final scene. This is where he kind of stands in front of Horus. He actually addresses Horus as my son, which really annoys Horus Lupercal. Horus attempts to kind of, humiliate him. One of the things Horus is able to do is read people's names from the air. And the reason that's important is because if you can read the Custodian's entire name and you are sufficiently powerful enough, you can use that to dominate their mind, which I think is how Horus ended up controlling so many Custodians. He could read what their names were, and their names are not short. Like Constantine Valdor's, I think, is 1,900 words long or something like that. But someone like Horus is able to use that to his advantage. And Countess Dusk stands before Horus Lupercal and makes his final scene. When he does, Horus Lupercal uses his power to just smite him down and emits such a level of power, nothing could survive it. But somehow, Countess Dusk is still standing and takes this mighty blow. And Horus is so confused by this. How could anybody survive? And then he realizes it's sigillite magic. This mark that Malcador put on the Custodian has kept him alive. And Countess Dusk is still standing, by his will. Fantastic last scene, genuinely very emotional. However, Horus won't make the same mistake twice, so he figures out a way to kind of overcome the power of Malcador in this respect and ends up completely destroying Countess Dusk. It's said that nothing organic remains afterwards, but for such a kind of like relatively minor character, fantastic ending. Loved it. Don't know what you thought.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think the sort of sequential killing of the Custodian and then Ollanius straight afterwards is a super interesting scene. I think it kind of it was something that was actually a bit surprising to me, because everything that happens in this fight basically happens the way you would expect it to. there was
Yes.
no, like, and Sanguinius comes back from the dead and, like, body slams Horus. Like, there was no crazy, unexpected anything. But it tied together every thread and every theory and every piece of lore from kind of everywhere, and made all of it true.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favourite things about the Siege of Terra just generally, is that there is no what I would call subversion for subversion's sake. For example, you watch the end of Game of Thrones or something, they're like, oh, you guys would have never guessed that Jon Snow doesn't even fight the Night King, would you? You'd never guess that. And you go, no, why would I guess
that sucks.
That's a terrible story. Why would you write that? They don't do that. And I am so grateful that the writers of Black Library didn't do that. Exactly as you say, some things play out kind of as you'd imagine they would do. They still pull it off. It still works. And you certainly don't feel cheated. It certainly doesn't feel boring. It's still incredibly exciting. And there's still enough, because there's so much in this story where some of these things were based off myth. Things that we thought might happen, and what Dan Abnett had to do, I guess, with the team at Black Library is figure out which things actually happened, which things are kind of based on reality. So, for example, the story of Ollanius Persson becomes the myth because of the actions of the Imperial cult at the end of the novel. So there's things like that are really cool. But, for example, the Blood Angels tell themselves over and over again that the death of Sanguinius was a necessary component for the Emperor's victory versus Horus, because Sanguinius put a chink in Horus's armor, and that has been put into every single Blood Angel's codex, and I presume will be put into all of the ones that come afterwards. But in truth, from this novel, nothing that Sanguinius did caused the Emperor to beat Horus. You might be able to maybe read some sort of emotional effect, maybe, and you're perfectly at liberty to do so, but really there's nothing clear. And you know what? I think that's fine. I think sometimes a death is just a death. I think that Sanguinius did everything he could to try and spare his sons from the horrible fate that was coming for them. He tried to do everything he could to ensure that the Emperor would be able to defeat Horus. And his ultimate death is, I didn't leave a sour taste in my mouth, because ultimately it was Sanguinius being the noble Sanguinius that we all know he would be. It was the perfect ending for his character. And I'm so glad the Black Library authors didn't try and do you'll never guess this would happen. It was just kind of perfect. And in a way, it's not just Dan Abnett's story, I guess, is it? Which must be the most interesting privilege to have, because he has to write this story that was written about decades ago and was formulated over such a long period of time. So it's such an interesting kind of way of writing a book, I got to imagine.
Now that we're talking about it, a quick tangent. I will say the Sanguinius fight is actually one of the way more subversive things that happens in the siege, because you're right, there is no single moment where he puts the chink in Horus's armor. The fight almost seems totally meaningless. Sanguinius doesn't fall to the rage at all. Quite the opposite. He's completely controlled emotionally throughout the entire fight. And so, none of the things we thought would happen during that fight happen at all. However, what does happen is Sanguinius' sacrifice enables all of the Loyalist forces to actually survive in the end, or to keep fighting, because all the Blood Angels go mad and go into a killing frenzy. And it turns into kind of the one thing that means that the Loyalists are able to fight for long enough to survive so that the Emperor can go do his thing. So it's not so much that Sanguinius has an effect on the fight with the Emperor. Sanguinius has an effect in that he allows the Emperor time to do what he needs to.
Yeah, there's absolutely ways you can look at it from that point of view. I also will say as well, the thing I really like about the story is how things like the myth that the Blood Angels have, that, Sanguinius put a chink in Horus's armor, they totally make sense. Because, of course, that's what the sons would say about their father. Of course, that's what they repeat to themselves again and again over the next 10,000 years. And, the end of the Custodian, a true hero, Kekautus Dusk. Whilst this is going on, I should say, we also find out what happens to Litu in the story. And it's one of my favourite things that happen for a character. The concept of Litu is honestly so bizarre. I've done a video on this for members before and spoken quite a bit about Litu. Litu is a reference to the limited edition 2 Space Marine. It was part of the limited edition 2 set. And Dan Abnett thought that was funny, apparently, and made a character called Ellie2, like so they call him Litu, and he has now become one of the most important characters in the setting, which is, I think, objectively quite hilarious. But his story is really good. So whilst Cleicautus Dusk is distracting Horus Lupercal, Litu is trying to pull out these metal shards that are binding the Emperor to this chair that Horus has put him in. And he tells the Emperor that he's here to help the Emperor. And he made this ultimate promise to Erda, who was the mother of the Primarchs. And we don't know exactly the Emperor's feelings towards her, but certainly the fact that he never killed her, even though she betrayed him, suggests some sort of love or respect there at least. And so he's there to kind of serve the Emperor in this regard. And he's trying to get the Emperor to wake up. Wake up, your demon son is coming to kill you. He's shaking the Emperor. And from behind, Horus just grabs him and pulls him up. And I mentioned earlier how Horus can kind of read names out of the air. However, he can't read Litu's name because Litu doesn't have a name. His number is just LE2. And so he's so confused what this Space Marine is, because this is just some Space Marine that doesn't even have a Primarch. And then there's a really interesting reveal in this scene, because Horus was listening to what Litu said, and he says, "You said a name, Erda. Did she send you here?" And Litu very much views Erda as his mother and the Emperor as his father. So Horus, it's like, Erebus has told me that he's killed Erda, and Litu has a very kind of emotional response, as you'd imagine. But what's quite interesting about that, and I don't know if you thought about this, where Horus reveals that he was aware of Erda's existence, which is the first we've ever had from any Primarch ever. One of them was aware of Erda's existence. Presumably he was enlightened by the Chaos Gods as to her role in the Primarch scattering.
For a start, Erda is a really interesting, because she kind of just appears and then immediately disappears. This fantastically important, crazy powerful character who then... Oh, she's dead now, okay.
Massively important, not in the next book, dies in the next book. Cool.
Yeah, right?
Nice to meet you.
It comes out of nowhere. You're like, oh my god, she's... okay, she's gone. And so, like, that leads me to believe that A, she's probably not dead, and B, that she has got to be set up for something, anything in the future. And it will probably be something to do with Litu. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see, like, what part Erda plays in the future. If I were to suspect anything to do with Erda and Horus, I think it's two things. Number one, I think Horus was so arrogant in his own power that he just didn't give a shit about anything to do with Erda. Because, like, for example, when he's talking to Litu, he's just curious because Litu's so weird. He's just like, what the hell are you?
Yeah.
Like, it would be like walking into work and everyone's dressed like clowns. You'd be like, what? What? This is so weird. You'd just be taken aback for a moment. And it's the same thing here. And yeah, I just don't think Horus cares too much about that at this point. But also on top of that, adding a backstory with Horus and Erda right now in the story would have been detrimental to the flow of the fight, and also I think would have just been like a whole nother thing to add, so I don't think they would have had time to add anything. But yeah, Erda is a very pivotal character, and I am fascinated to see what happens about her in the future.
Her death is so abrupt that it feels like she was introduced for a reason, and that reason will be revealed later on. You could have absolutely told the story without introducing her somehow. You could have just had Litu be some space marine in the Imperial Palace that doesn't have a Primarch. The story would have worked. Either she's alive somehow, and she might be alive because, to clarify, she's killed by Erebus, who wields an Athame dagger. Athame daggers are very, very powerful. It's never actually said they can kill perpetuals, though. And given how important the Fulgurite dagger is in the Heresy, a weapon that can kill a perpetual, I don't really get the point, because also Erebus is after the Fulgurite dagger in the Heresy, despite the fact he has the Athame dagger. And the Athame dagger, the Fulgurite ends up being used to the Imperium's benefit through the kind of the healing of Vulcan. So maybe there's something in that. I'm not entirely sure. So I'd love it if Dan Abnett just went, oh yeah, Erebus is just an idiot. that
I think we'd all like that.
That would just be great. I'd like that. But I also think the other option is that they do something retrospectively, because whilst the Horus heresy is essentially over, it is by no means closed, and they will absolutely write stories of Primarchs and things from the Great Crusade, etc., as is relevant. They still sell miniatures for that game, and so they will absolutely add stuff to that story. But yes, sorry, really interesting tangent. Which leads us on then to what happens to Leetu in the fight. This is going to sound like I'm exaggerating, but Horus, as I say, has grabbed Leetu from behind, picked him up, and at this point, he throws Leetu at Khorne. And it sounds like an exaggeration, but yeah, he does. So he kind of throws him through seemingly another dimension. He throws him like hundreds of meters because he's so strong. And Leetu ends up hitting this wall, sliding down, and he looks up and he realizes that's not a wall, that's the haft of an axe. And he looks up in horror to realize he is surrounded by the Chaos Gods, and he looks up into the eyes of Khorne. And the chapter ends with there's not even any point screaming. We will see Leetu again later on, but this is also importantly not addressed. At no point does Leetu mention that this happens. So presumably this is going to be connected to his story in the future. I think it's probably too cheap to use that just to say Leetu's been possessed or something somehow, but I can't imagine this hasn't deeply affected the character to be that close to the Chaos Gods. Has got to be a ridiculous experience. He's probably the only person in the setting who has been that close to the 4 Chaos Gods. Absolutely terrifying concept.
100%. Genuinely, that's one of my favourite scenes in all of Warhammer. Because A, it comes out of nowhere. Like, it just kind of happens. And he looks up and you're like, holy shit, is that Khorne? And you, as someone who like plays the game, you're just like, what? How has this happened? And literally never gets addressed. It doesn't say how he gets out of there. It doesn't say how he survived. Nothing. It's almost as if he gets knocked into Khorne's axe. Khorne looks down at him and goes, huh, and then looks back to the fight, and Leetu kind of walks off.
Yeah.
It's almost this sort of hilarious scene, but like, again, that's something someone's going to have to talk about at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. As I say, I hope this story of the Horus heresy isn't closed. And I'd love to read just a short story on how the hell Leetu got out of that situation. Absolutely
oh my
brutal.
god, yeah.
But that takes us on then. So that is Kekautus Dusk and Leetu out of the fight now. So it is just the Emperor versus Horus. No more delays, no more interruptions. Except, of course, for Loken, who is still at this point stuck in this other dimension where he is having conversations and fighting centaurs that look remarkably like members of the Mournival. And at this point, we go on to maybe one of the most brutal scenes. Again, very grimdark moment between Horus and the Emperor, where the Emperor is at this point so badly beaten. He's so dazed and confused that he is essentially being led by Horus to this throne of Slaanesh that Horus made for him. This scene again is also, I'll be honest, it's quite funny. Okay, so Horus leads the Emperor to this chair, and the Emperor is so down and beaten. Eventually, he kind of puts his hand on Horus's chest plate, and he kind of looks up at Horus, and Horus thinks, I'm actually getting through to the Emperor a little bit. That's what it looks like. But all of a sudden, the Emperor's hand starts to heat up, and he realizes that the Emperor is stealing Horus's own power and using it against him. And we talked earlier about how Horus is so much more powerful than the Emperor. The reason the Emperor can do this, apparently, without Horus noticing, is because Horus is so powerful, the level of power the Emperor needs to blast Horus across the room and restore himself entirely is such a small amount of power in terms of Horus's total power level, Horus doesn't even notice. So the Emperor steals Horus's own power and secretly puts his hand on his chest to blast Horus across the room. But what's really quite funny is he also puts a sigil on Horus's chest plate. So he blasts Horus across the room, and then Horus is like, that was ridiculous, and then looks down, sees the other sigil, and gets sent again, blasted back, like a delayed magic timer.
again, this really emphasizes the desperation of the situation. It's kind of like when you have like Arnold Schwarzenegger versus the Predator, and you know Arnie like takes out a knife from the Predator's belt and like stabs him in the neck with it.
Yeah.
Like using his own weapons against him because he's got nothing. There's nothing he's got. So he's just like, that's great. This will do. And so yeah, I love how, especially in this later part of the siege, there are so many things that are, you know, emblematic of the utter desperation of the situation. Everything has gone wrong. All the walls have fallen. There are no weapons left. And so they have to steal them from the enemy. I love this scene for like just that desperation. This like final punch drunk like swing.
So there's one gift that Horus has for the Emperor in the book, which is a bloodlit crown, which he creates to put on the Emperor's head. The Emperor actually takes this off. He uses it as a weapon against Horus at one point, and Horus is just like, "Oh, it's all right, I can make another for you." So at this point, the Emperor is, been beaten again. He got in a bunch of really good shots against Horus, did a whole bunch of damage, but Horus was certainly able to just rebuild himself almost instantly and did a whole bunch of damage to his father. And he's told the Emperor that he could have killed him at any time, but he wanted to give the Emperor the choice of joining his new Imperium. And at this point, that's when Ollanius, Persson, and John Grammaticus teleport into the room. If you're not familiar, they were the ones who made it to the Emperor as the Emperor was ascending to godhood, and Ollanius convinced the Emperor not to do this, and why it was a terrible mistake to become a god of the warp. The Emperor accepted what they said. He relinquished his power. But before he relinquished his power, he used it one final time to heal them, heal Litu, who had also suffered a grave wound, and also heal their weaponry. So, for example, Ollanius had a rifle, which becomes like brand new. And one of the things that he also healed is the Athame dagger. And this Athame dagger is very important in Warhammer 40k. It has killed 7 people so far and has now come to Ollanius' person. And Ollanius has realized that this dagger might be the difference. It might be the only thing that can kill Horus Lupercal at his power level. So even though he's convinced the Emperor not to ascend to godhood, which retrospectively seems to have been his purpose, he's gone, I could go back. I could go back and give this dagger to the Emperor to allow him to beat his son. And he's like, how do we get back to the Emperor? And they end up contacting this witch who has been working with Rogel Dawn and trapped under all this rubble. And this witch called Agte teleports them into the Vengeful Spirit, or as close as she can. And so they all of a sudden randomly appear in the throne room. Horus again, very confused. Who are these people? What are they doing here? They're definitely about to die. Horus looks down at them. However, Ollanius' Persson knows some words of Enuncia. And John Grammaticus also knows a word of Enuncia. These words essentially are the language of the universe. So he utters this word and it catapults Horus across the room and like disassembles him and buys them a brief amount of time. Now, the story of John and Oll is something, again, we'll probably have to talk about in another video because it's very complicated. But essentially, they found out from the Emperor that they need to create a causal loop that will always allow them to find the Emperor in the future, because they realize that the story of how they found the Emperor has a lot of kind of like weird conveniences about it. So that was very lucky. And the Emperor says maybe it's not so much a coincidence, maybe someone caused these things to happen, and maybe it's you messing with time. And so that's what they're kind of doing. So John Grammaticus takes this opportunity to leave, but Oll decides to stay. Oll decides to stay and to help the Emperor if he can.
Oll kneels back down at the Emperor's side. There has been no further sign of life. I brought this knife, he says, as though resuming a casual conversation. It's, well, you'll understand what it is, I'm sure. You'll feel it. You can use it. I think it might be the only thing you can use. Here. He holds it out. There's no response. He tries to lift the Emperor's hand, but it's too big and too heavy. He settles for pressing the knife into its grip and trying to close the armoured fingers around it. The knife looks so small in that hand. Ridiculous. So you've got it now. All you have to do is wake up. Be alive. Be alive and wake up. It isn't over. So I'm really hoping, that you can hear me and that you're going to get up any second now. Get up. Oh, come on. He sits back. We had a plan, he says. Remember? You had a plan. A great plan. It still matters. I'm going to help you with it. You asked me to. Do you remember that? You asked me to help you get it right this time. Advise you. Keep you true. Keep you moving in the right direction. And I will. I will this time. I promise you. Not like before. I'll stand right beside you and I'll help you make it work. For everybody's sake. All you've got to do is get up. He breathes hard. He can feel the pulse thumping in his neck. Please, friend. My old friend. Please. Oll looks down at the knife to make sure it hasn't slipped out of the slack fingers. He sees something on the deck, covered in a thick layer of dust. He brushes the grit aside. 2 cards of the Imperial Tarot, dropped, discarded. Both wafers are scorched black around the edge. He picks them up. The guardsman, stalwart with his lion. The lantern, sending its frail beam into the night. That's you and me then, Oll says, looking at them. You and me. He lays the lantern on the Emperor's dusty chestplate. He stares at the guardsman and then tucks it in his breast pocket. All you have to do is get up, he says. He can suddenly feel his left eyelid fluttering. Something stirs, a skitter of loose debris, a scrape of metal. The Emperor is as still and silent as before. Oll looks behind him. Across the chamber, the black shape is shifting. It twitches like a scarab on its back. It stirs. Horus Lupercal sits up and hauls himself upright. Horus rises. Horus stands. Black bone and blacker light fume around him, repairing and restoring the burnt materia of his wargear and his flesh. He is as terrible as before. More terrible, more awful, unbearable. A black mass lit from within by a ghastly, bloody light. He takes a step forward, then another, his pace increasing into a stride. Each footstep shakes the deck and rings out like a falling tank. Oll gets up. You have to wake up now, he says urgently. Horus approaches, wordless, furious. You really have to get up, Oll calls. Please, get up. Get the hell up. Horus is closing. The War Master reaches out a huge hand. The immense maul scrapes across the deck with a shriek and then flies straight into his grip. Oll steps forward to face him. He puts himself between the Emperor and the oncoming monster. He pulls his las rifle to his shoulder, arms it and aims it. He knows there's no point, but it's better than nothing. Get up now, he yells over his shoulder. Please, get up. Horus is just meters away. He's not slowing down. Oll pulls the rifle in against his cheek, flexes his grip, and settles his finger on the trigger. No further, he yells. Damn you. I won't let you touch him. Horus keeps coming. Oll opens fire. Full auto sustained. The las bolts flicker and spatter off the black warplate like candle flames in a night wind. Oll Persson is still firing when the talon of Horus reduces him to a drifting red fog.
It was one of those stories in the Heresy that you feel like that you were working through, and I think part of it is because the storyline of the Cabal almost instantly went nowhere. These plot lines, you're like, am I not connected to these characters? But the death of Ollanius Persson was genuinely very sad. The Emperor had said to Oll before that Oll will have a place in his future Imperium, and Ollanius Persson's place in the Imperium was supposed to be the person who stops the Emperor from going too far. He knows the Emperor's character, he knows the Emperor's flaws. He's the Emperor's oldest friend, essentially. So, he had this plan, and so he runs over to the Emperor, very sad, and it says, you said we could do this, we could rebuild the Imperium together. He keeps trying to get the Emperor to get up, but he can't, and in the end, he places the dagger into the Emperor's hand, and just takes the rifle. And legendary scene. All fans of 40k know the story of the guardsman who stood before Horus Lupercal in front of the Emperor of Mankind. It's a really great scene. Like the little details, like he switches on auto. That's it. Do everything you can. Of course, he is a perpetual. He can supposedly regenerate from almost any wound, but he is nothing compared to Horus Lupercal, and he is turned into a red fog. And I don't think he's coming back from that one, Quipster. I'll be honest with you.
I agree. And to be honest, the thing about Ollanius Person's story is I'm glad it was him in one of the previous books. I think it's Saturnine, actually, where there is a guardsman who faces down Angron with his silly grenade launcher gun. And it's sort of played out like, oh, this is where the story of, a guardsman versus Horus comes from. And it just ends up being this bigger exaggerated tale, and it wasn't a guardsman versus Horus, it was a guardsman versus Angron, and I thought, oh, I don't like that as much. Whereas no, the story of the guardsman who charged against Horus actually becomes an actual thing that happened, and I really like that. So just from that particular standpoint, I really like it. But also, I'm just going to say this right now, I called it. I called it as soon as the second book came out. I knew the anatheme, the broken anatheme, was in his pocket. I was just like, oh, if it fixed the last gun, it fixed the anatheme in his pocket. And I said that at the time.
I can do even better than that, mate. I called it with the first one. The video is still up. You can watch it. After the End of the Death Volume 1 came out, there's a very specific line in the End of the Death 1 where Ollanius Persson says, "This dagger in the hands of a perpetual may be the only thing that can kill Horus Lupercal." And I was like, top foreshadowing there, Dan. Fantastic work. Which is why, after the end, when he supposedly leaves, I was like, I don't think he's gone.
That's not the last we've seen of him. I mean, I think this is something you talked about before, and until you said it, it hadn't properly occurred to me that Old Person's name is Old Person, and he's a perpetual.
Yeah, fantastic. It's
so
no word.
dumb, I love it.
Warhammer 40k lore has no right to be this good when the naming conventions are so bad. Like, it's so bad.
Ferrus Manners, his name is like Iron Hand.
Well, I was. This is a big spoiler. I was doing a video on Nikona Sharakin, and Nikona Sharakin uses this Space Marine organ to essentially enter almost like a stasis that they can enter, like a cocoon kind of thing, and they can survive in space even. It's a very, very powerful ability. And it's, how he might make it through to 40k. It's basically the video. But, like, do you want to know what the membrane's called? It's called the Susan membrane. Someone just named the membrane after their friend or their wife or girlfriend or something. And that is now the official name of, like, one of the most important organs for Space Marines. Very bizarre. I will say there are a lot of really, lines that go so hard in this novel. That takes us in then to kind of the final part of the fight. At this point, on Terra, for your reference, the Imperial cult with the Dark Angels and Sigismund, who eventually turns up, they end up getting the Astronomicon relit. And the book kind of implies that this is going to be able to give the Emperor a bit of a boost. However, before we get to the outcome of that, Ollanius Persson was kind of the second last thing to intervene with the fight, because, of course, Garvior Loken is still out there. I don't know exactly how to introduce this for the people watching along who maybe haven't read the book, but let's just say that Garvior Loken all of a sudden turns up. Loken tries to stop Horus Lupercal from killing the Emperor of Mankind, but he can't. There's nothing he can do to stop Horus Lupercal's power. Horus has finally realised that there's no bringing the Emperor around to kind of his point of view, and so he kills the Emperor. Absolutely brutal.
That scene where that happened, I was just like, you what?
Yeah.
It is portrayed, and it's the end of the fight. The Emperor just loses, and he has his head literally kicked in. He's like a red paste on the floor, and you're like, oh my god. What? What's on the Golden Throne then? That's what went through my mind. It's so forthright, and it happens with absolutely no like guile to it, so you think. And so you kind of half take it at face value and you're like, what has just occurred?
Yeah, it's a brutal death for the Emperor. It's said that Horus doesn't even enjoy it. It's so savage. There's no joy to be had from this fight. The Chaos Gods are loving it, as you can imagine. There's nothing Loken can do to stop Horus from killing the Emperor, and the Emperor is dead. So with the Emperor dead, Garvior Loken actually says to Horus, you've killed your father, yes, but what's the point in this victory? What would be the point in you killing your father to just be some pawn of chaos? You have the choice here. You can choose to let go of your power. You don't have to be their puppet. It's your choice. And Horus Lupercal thinks about it, and for a moment, he agrees. There is a bit of nobility still within Horus Lupercal. I'll let go of the powers of chaos. Now, one thing we've not really spoken about in the stream up until now is that another thing that's been really annoying Horus throughout this entire book is the whispering that has been coming from the demons, the Neverborn, who are, of course, arrayed around them and kind of watching as the Chaos Gods are. And he keeps saying, like, you know, shut up, stop whispering. Like, it's really annoying. You guys keep whispering. And as he talks to Loken, he's quite melancholic and he's genuinely quite sad that he's had to kill his father. At this point, he's starting to realize that whispering, it might not be the demons. And the whispering is apparently the words, the Emperor must live. And this has been spread throughout Terra. Millions of people are now chanting, or at least thinking in their head, the words, the Emperor must live, over and over again. And at that point, Horus realizes that he has fallen for one last trick of the Emperor of Mankind. That Garvior Loken we'd been talking about was not Garvior Loken. That body is not the Emperor's body. It disintegrates almost immediately into ash. That version of Garvior Loken is not real. It disappears. And the Emperor has tricked Horus into letting go of his power, however briefly. And Horus desperately tries to kind of recall that power back to himself. And initially the Chaos Gods are like, no, you rejected us. We're going to punish you for it. Until they realize that the Emperor is not dead and he's potentially about to ruin all this work that they've put in to destroy the Imperium. The Emperor rises up. He's empowered by the Astronomicon being relit and all the faith on Terra, and Horus Lupercal looks at him and says, you are no god. The Emperor responds with, then this will be a fair fight, which is a hard line, loved that. And at that point, they have one final clash. Horus desperately trying to recall the powers of chaos. The Chaos Gods want to give him the power back, but the Emperor is not having it. And makes relatively short work of his son now that they're on, I say equal footing, but Horus is now basically just a Primarch again. He stands no chance versus the Master of Mankind.
You are no god, you shout. Then this will be a fair fight, the Whispers answer. You howl your defiance as he comes at you. He is clearly weak and wounded, but you are weak too. You have gathered up but a fraction of the power you had. You must keep him at bay for a moment longer. Hold him back while you recover your full strength. For in this moment, you are just Horus Lupercal. You swing Worldbreaker and deflect the path of his sword. Sparks fly like comets. Your talon rakes through armor, flesh and bone. Blood fogs the air between you. His mind burns through your nervous system, disrupting your motor control and cascading pain through your core. You block his mind, twist it sideways through 13 dimensions and render irreparable ischemic damage. You clamp his throat with your talon, you crush his windpipe and sever his carotid. Blood squirts in a hosing arc. More blood snorts and spurts from his mouth as he chokes. He batters his blade across your skull and shoulder, shredding the serpent's scales. You push him away, refractors banging as they fail and collapse, and punish him with your maul as he staggers back, clutching at his throat. You break his wrist, the warblade clatters from his hand. You crunch his ribs. You unleash bloodlight from the eye of your chestplate and torch his face. His hair burns, the flesh of his cheek melts to the bone.
One eye roasts and bursts. Worldbreaker shatters his spine. You feel the power returning to you. It can't come fast enough. You need all of it. You need all of it. Reeling, he burns you back. A beam of light rakes from his one remaining eye. Pure force, blue-white, the focused will of the human race, piercing your darkness as the beacon of the hollow mountain pierces the void. The pain is more than a man can bear, and you are still just a man. It's not the power, it's what you do with it, and you, fool, let it go. You let it all go. You fall to your knees, on fire within and without. His psychic beam continues to incinerate you. Please, you ask. Please, you implore. Give it back. Give the power back to me. Oh, they will. They will. The old four will let you have it all back, because it serves their interests. But they will make you suffer first, as a cautionary reprimand for spurning their generous gifts. They will make you pay for that, in fire and agony, and they will let the punishment last a while. The Emperor, their only real foe, cannot kill you, after all. For all the power he salvaged and scraped together, for all the tricks he has played to weaken you and render you vulnerable when you were entirely invulnerable, for all the ways he has made you look like a fool, he cannot actually kill you. He does not have the means, not even him, to kill the limitless thing you have become, the instrument of chaos incarnate. Because that's what you are, Horus Lupercal. That's all you are, Warmaster. That is all you'll ever be, First Found Son. A slave to their darkness, a weapon in their hands, a puppet on their strings, beguiled by their promises and lies, an instrument with no mind of its own, designed to shatter the shield of humanity and tip the human species into the neverness of the warp. On your knees, caught in the torrent of your father's flame, you look up at him. You see it now, at last, perhaps as he always has seen it. A simple truth, a secret that should have been kept, despite everything. Some truths are too dangerous to know, or too lethal to hear. That's why he kept it for 30,000 years. Now you know it too. You see, through insurmountable pain, everything that has been ruined, and everything that has been betrayed. You cannot ask him for forgiveness. You don't dare, and you can't speak it anyway. But he can see it in your eyes. You were too weak to resist them then, and you will be too weak in another moment when they relent and replenish you with their abominable gifts. Your eyes beg him for mercy. A son to his father. End this. End it now, if you can. If that is even possible, end it before it is too late. If you can't do it, no one can. The burning stops. The psychic beam abates. You sway, gasping. Your father has a knife, an old stone thing. What is it? It's so small in his hand, so ugly. That won't do it. That won't be enough. He seems to hesitate, reluctant. You clench, in sudden spasm and convulsion, and cry out. The power is returning. It is flowing back into you with great rapidity, as though the old four are suddenly desperate to restore their gifts. What do they know? What have they seen that makes them act in such haste? Your father looks at the knife. I wait for you, and I forgive you. He drives it into your heart. Loken is on his feet. He sees the giant blade glint. A simple stone knife won't break that plate. Something so small surely can't. The blade goes in, heart thrust, the quick mercy stroke of a Custodian's Misericordia, practical and unfussy. The two figures freeze together for a moment, the kneeling son, the standing father, joined by the knife. And through that blade, the Emperor channels the full force of his will. The sublime power A psychic blast of profound magnitude courses down the ancient blade like lightning conducting through a metal rod. The fireball flash of its strike is brighter than all creation. Then, the light begins to die. A darkness falls quickly. It is not the glossy blackness of the court's infinite architecture. It is soft and mute, like the advent of night or the dimming of vision and sense. Horus smiles. His smile is no longer the terrible smile that greeted them when they entered the Lupercal court. The smile that shivered the world with mortal dread. It is now the smile Loken remembers from long ago. There is no blood. The athame is sharp. Sharp enough to cut space. Sharp enough to slice reality. It has waited a long, long time for this. From the original killing that made it and stained it with the shadow of all murder, to this, the 8th death that it was promised. Horus smiles. The smile vanishes. Then so does flesh, lips and mouth, revealing another smile. A rictus grin of teeth, a mask of bone. There is no redemption, for the time for that is long past. There is only resignation. And in the end, it's just a man killing his son with a stone. The blade slides out and turns to dust. The body falls, and then the galaxy burns.
This is the part of the story I didn't see coming. The bit with the Emperor getting his head kicked in, I knew something was up there. But with the Emperor telling Horus, no, up this power because you will be a man. I love it because it inspires a bit of hope. It inspires this idea that Horus could have been redeemed. He could have rejected the power of chaos because he did. He did reject the power of chaos. It flowed out of him. There was hope for him yet. And that's when he gets killed. Again, it's this snatching away of a potential fascinating and positive future that could have existed. I think that's the crux of it. And that's why, like, when people say, like, oh, it's not grimdark, I think it's so grimdark.
Yeah, no, I like your point there. I think it goes back, I mentioned earlier, it's kind of up to the reader to decide whether you think Horus was ultimately a pawn of chaos, because exactly as you say, in a way, Horus played this almost perfectly. Everyone thinks Horus is a moron at this point in time. It's worth remembering. Perturabo thinks Horus has just been messing up. He thinks he's wasted the legions. He's just throwing legionnaires at Dawn's defenses, and it's just kind of wasting. He's not giving Perturabo the support that he needs. So many people think he's just the pawn of chaos and the chaos gods are the ultimate power. But actually, if Horus hadn't fallen for this last final trick, then he, as you say, would have taken over Terra, been the new emperor of the Imperium, and could have relinquished the powers of chaos and could have been kind of the new ruler. And in that respect, he could have won. So it was his own downfall. It's quite funny because you get that scene where you might think that the chaos gods just kind of own Horus and he's just their pawn, but they want to punish him for giving away the power. However, they genuinely panic. We should say as well, the Chaos Gods view this as a loss. It's made very clear at the end of the book. They desperately try and give their power back to Horus because they want the Emperor to die, because they know that he is their anathema. Throughout the book, Horus is kind of big insult against the Emperor, as that the Emperor is a liar, he's a trickster, he's a fraud. And the irony, of course, is that he ends up falling for his greatest trick, which is quite funny because, you know, as an Imperium fan, you kind of do the opposite. You're like, no, the Emperor's not a fraud. He's the Emperor. He's this incredibly powerful being. But he wins through trick and deception again and again. He is this kind of trickster within the setting.
I was going to say, there's a really interesting thing that sort of adds on to that. We have, as Imperium fanboys, I mean, okay, I'm going to add this. I'm wearing a Custodian's t-shirt. I've got a chair with like the Imperial logo on it. And so like, I'm an Imperial fanboy. And I think as, you know, fanboys, we have this like propaganda element within our psyche that, you know, the Emperor's always got this plan and he's this godlike figure and he's got it all figured out and planned and everything's part of his, you know, construct for the future. But if you contrast that to everything that happens in this fight, everything is a desperate gambit. Every single thing is a last ditch hope. Every single thing is him on the back foot. And then there's another really good example of this when Vulcan is walking through the webway on his way to fight Magnus. He's looking around at the webway project and he's like, this is all a massive bodge job. Like, would this have actually worked? Especially into the future? Like, he's not sure that it would have done. And so, again, it shows this idea that the Emperor is not this all-powerful being we kind of expect and want him to be. Everything is a desperate last stand or like last hope kind of thing. And so, yeah, I really like this bit of the story where he's like, yeah, on his last legs, he just pulls something out of his ass, basically.
There's another part in the book where we see the notes of Malkador through in another storyline. A video I've done on the Terminus Decree explains this. And in the notes of Malkador details the many disagreements that the Emperor and the Sigillite had over the years. They disagreed on many things over the years, but of course the Emperor is the ultimate power and he had the final say. However, in Buried Dagger, the final book of like the Horus Heresy before you get to the Siege of Terra, the Emperor says that looking back, he realizes that Malkador was right on most things that they disagreed on. And so the Emperor himself is totally willing to see that he is not infallible. A really good example, actually, is that we get to see Sanguinius's foresight multiple times throughout the Horus Heresy and Siege of Terra. And we see, for example, the prophecies of Sanguinius, which end up alluding kind of sort of to the Tyranids and sort of to Dante and things like that. And so you can kind of interpret them in multiple ways. It's very clear that Sanguinius's foresight is not exact. It's open to interpretation. And the Emperor says Sanguinius's foresight is actually more powerful and clearer than the Emperor's. The Emperor really doesn't see things clearly in the future. He might get glimpses that there is some terrible force coming to assail humanity. That's what makes him panic and rush the Great Crusade. But he doesn't actually know precisely how things are going to play out. Malkador seems to make it clear in the book that the Emperor had foreseen he might have to go onto the Golden Throne at some point for a very long time. So that was within their predictions. But they didn't know the exact circumstances that would lead to that. It's a very common misconception people have with the Emperor, is that his foresight is ultimate foresight and he knows everything. And even some custodians in like the Regent Shadow series make that mistake and they think that the Emperor has kind of ultimate view of everything that's going to happen. Sorry, long tangent. Yes, anyway, so which takes us on to kind of the final bit we're going to talk about today, which is the ultimate death of Horus Lupercal. Very sad moment. At this point, the real Loken does show up, and Loken gets to see the final death of his father. And in the end, Horus kind of welcomes it. He dies with a smile on his face. The Emperor does use the Athame dagger to kind of stab Horus in the heart. He channels all of his power kind of through the Athame dagger to kill Horus. The Athame dagger afterwards is lost. And we get the final words of the Emperor of Mankind before he goes onto the Golden Throne, which are, "I wait for you and I forgive you." We talked about there wasn't lots of subversion for subversion's sake. I think those words were very carefully chosen. Dan Abnett knows what he's doing. He knows what we're all going to think when we read those words. What are we all thinking, Quipster?
I mean, as soon as you hear those words, the very first thing you're thinking is Ferrus Manus. Ferrus Manus' soul still exists in the world. And Ferrus Manus' soul came back.
In the previous book, we see, actually.
Exactly. And so Ferrus Manus just comes back, so can Horus. Because this is actually a bit of a retcon. Because originally, it's the Emperor mind blasts Horus and not only kills him, but erases him. And that is not quite what happens here.
Well, what's really interesting about that, I think, is that, you say retcon, but like in a way it's not a retcon in my eyes, because that story of how the Emperor defeated Horus is like the mythology of the setting. you can put that down very easily as to that's some account of an inquisitor or historiographer 1,000 years after the Horus heresy. The fact that they get the details wrong like that makes sense. And for example, somebody writing into the lore that the soul of Horus Lupercal was utterly obliterated totally makes sense, because if I lived in the Imperium, I would not want people in the Imperium to have any fear that Horus Lupercal might one day return. Like, that's a terrifying prospect. The guy that, nearly killed the Emperor could come back someday. So scary. You'd assume that that's what the Emperor had done. You'd assume that there's no way Horus can return.
100%. And I like it as a thing as well. I'd love to look back on this in like 3, 4, 5 years to see where this goes. Because it's clear that there's so many things that happen in this story that are a setup for something. Like,
yeah.
This is something the authors have talked about quite a bit. Not everything is a setup for something else. Some things that happen in the setting are there deliberately so you ask questions. Good example of that is, I think it's Malkador who says, oh, there's only one of you, one of the Primarchs, that was told the true nature of chaos from the beginning. Like, I think we suspect that it's Lionel Johnson, but they never, because the whole point of that sentence is to show that there are more questions to be asked in the setting. It makes the setting feel bigger.
My favourite example of that is definitely there are no wolves on Fenris. This is a line that is repeated multiple times in the Heresy. It is essentially a meaningless line. It doesn't actually have any real implication for the Space Wolves and the setting. Also, there are very clearly wolves on Fenris, so it just makes no sense. It's just supposed to be this metaphorical thing. You're like, oh, is Sanguinius referring to the fact that they're not real wolves, they're like genetically approximate? It's like, take it any way you want. It doesn't have any payoff. Yeah. The rumor is that the writers were told to stop mentioning that line in books because people kept asking about it, and it's essentially just a random line that they just thought sounded cool as they put it in.
No, you're right. I love stuff like that. But I think this particular line doesn't feel like that. It feels like a setup for something. If not the return of Horus, but then something down the line, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think as well, there's always a difference, I think, between theorizing for the setting and theorizing for the end game. So when we talk about this, we're talking about how this is a thing that could happen. Horus Lupercal might be able to return in some way in the future, but it will come in like the end game of the setting. I don't think it's going to be, an 11th edition release. One of the things that they've been doing, I think, much better in recent books, the Black Legion series, Fall of Cadia, is building up Abaddon as a more interesting, empathetic, and apparent villain in the setting, and someone that you even root for at times. That's really important because he's kind of the main antagonist. So I don't think they're going to suddenly replace him with Horus or anything like that. But I will say as well, and again, sorry to connect to another plot line that we've not really talked about today, I won't go into it, but I've done a video on the Terminus Decree, and one of the weird outcomes of that storyline is the interaction with an Inquisitor, Zaranchek Xanthus, who we know is an imposter in the Inquisition, into the Scouring and into the setting. He founds Xanthism, which has a subculture to it called Horusianism. There's a Horusian book series, and it is based around this idea that some Inquisitors believe we should revive Horus and use him as the ultimate weapon against chaos, because chaos can be used to fight chaos. So Dan Abnett essentially introduces 2 plot lines in this book that could both lead to the return of Horus Lupercal in some way.
I don't think anyone really expected Horus to have this mea culpa moment where he goes, oh shit, I was wrong, and the Emperor actually forgives him. But that kind of just happens. It happens even despite the Emperor having cut off that, like, human part of himself, which I quite like, to be honest.
Absolutely. As you say, in theory, the Emperor supposedly cut off all of his love, loyalty, and compassion in the previous novel and sent those parts of himself into the warp. And we know in 40k that those parts of the Emperor are now incredibly powerful and are able to influence the galaxy through things like Imperial Saints, the Legion of the Damned, etc., etc. However, clearly there is still some love, loyalty, and compassion left within the Emperor, says, I wait for you and I forgive you. I just don't think you'd say that if you didn't love your son. In a way, this isn't really a massive retcon. For example, in Konrad Kurz's Primarch novel, we see Konrad Kurz speak to an effigy of the Emperor. And again, it's up to the reader to decide whether you think Konrad Kurz is really talking to the Emperor before his death. One of the things that version of the Emperor, which I choose to believe is the real Emperor, says to that version of Konrad Kurz, is that none of the Primarchs are beyond redemption. And none is a very specific word. That implies that all of the demon Primarchs can be returned to the Imperium in somehow, which is what Rabute Gilliman suggests to Mortarion in the Dark Imperium novel Godblight. So in theory, the idea that Primarchs could return to the setting, again, in the end game, we're talking, should Warhammer 40k ever end, Games Workshop stops making copious amounts of money from it, then this is absolutely on the cards. And so the idea of Horus Lupercal returning in that way, I think has realistically always been apparent. I imagine many people have theorized that that could happen. So in a way, this isn't like a massive retcon, but it is hanging over the setting now. This is what I really like, is that it's always going to be in our heads. We're always going to think about it. It will forever change Warhammer 40k. We're in the territory now, when we go forward to 40k, where we have Primarchs returning. We have the Leagues of Votann squats being a thing, and suggestions of, the Men of Stone and the Men of Gold. Games Workshop are moving forward with wild storylines, and I'm pretty confident that we won't see Horus Lupercal anytime soon, but I can never be certain, because people were certain the Primarchs will never come back. People were certain squats would never be a thing. You can't be certain about anything with Warhammer 40k, and that's one of the things that makes the setting so exciting right now.
I am actually of the opinion that eventually we will see every Primarch return. All of them. Including Ferrus Manus, and including some sort of version of Sanguinius. I don't think Sanguinius himself will turn up. I think the spirit of Sanguinius, or like an aspect of him. And I think the same is true of Horus. And I think that aspect of Horus, or that Horus when he reappears, could be, I don't know, maybe the avatar of the Emperor. Maybe. Because that would be crazy and super cool.
There are ways you could see that, I think. I think certainly Ferrus Manus. It's too cool not to do it. I think that, the idea of him returning, and absolutely, slight tangent, but in the previous novel, Sanguinius speaks to the alleged spirit of Ferrus Manus, who talks about how horrific it is to be dead in 40k, and even a Primarch's soul is constantly devoured by demons. Legion of the Damned, Ferrus Manus, GW, make it happen. That's not printing money, but it's as close as you get to printing money, let's face it.
I was just surprised by how quick the end of this book is. Yeah, they go from like the fights ended to, and they all lived somewhat kind of not quite happily ever after, like within 10 pages. And it's like, wait, what?
It's the chapter where the Emperor gets put onto the Golden Throne. Distressingly short as a chapter. Right? I was like, whoa, okay, that was fine. So, for example, there are brief descriptions of the Ultramarines kind of cleaning up Terra. But yeah, Malcador's last moments I thought would be stretched out a bit more. But I mean, he's written a lot of words. You can't knock it. But yeah, I hope we get more details on that. I hope we get a Scouring series. Should Games Workshop ever make a Mark 7 box set for the Heresy era, then that would be a very popular box.
I couldn't agree more. And what I'm kind of really hoping for is an epilogue novel for the Siege of Terra. This is what happened when they put the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Here's what happened when the Ultramarines landed. Like, it's just all this kind of stuff.
Well, you know what else I would do, right? Okay, is so one of the things that Dan Abnett, and he talks about this a lot in his afterwords, etc., is he talks about how he wrote the novels. There are a lot of decisions that he made that I think were very clever. The usage of things like the Dark Angels, the Imperial Fists, to kind of split up the novel and allow you to kind of get the insight into how things are going on in Terra, etc., etc. However, because the novels are so long, especially the second one, I imagine he's had to cut out a lot of stuff. I would love to just get that stuff in whatever form. It could be in the most random, disjointed, printing of pages, because I'd buy that book. If it was just called like other stuff from the Siege of Terra, and they just put in random books and paragraphs.
So essentially what we're asking for here is Unfinished Tales, but Warhammer.
Exactly. Yes, you are exactly right. And I think certainly the final Beckwin book, I think, is very likely to be the secret ending of the Siege of Terra. I think that's probably how we will retrospectively view that book. That's kind of my theory. I've done a video on that before, which I'll try and remember to link. There's a lot of things Dan Abnett does to link this series to his kind of flagship series, which is the Eisenhorn, Raven, and Beckwin series. So the Inquisitor series, as people say. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, that's it for this podcast, I guess is what it's become. Quipster, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this.
Always happy to be here.
But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please let us know in the comments, if you've read the book, what kind of things did you like? If you have any questions or things we haven't explained, please put those in the comments as well, because that will really help me kind of formulate the main video. Yeah, let me know. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.